The people of Savannah still whisper her name, though the wind itself seems to tremble when it does. They call her by many titles now, the Widow Beaumont, the Bride in Black, the Devil's Wife, but in that sultry summer of 1830 she was just Eveline Harrow, the young woman who returned to her father's ruined plantation, wearing a wedding dress that had never seen an altar, her hair undone, her eyes too calm for someone who claimed she had buried her husband herself. They say the first night she came back, the air around the Harrow estate turned thick as honey, and the hounds wouldn't go near the porch. They say the cicadas stopped their singing. The Harrow plantation had once been among the grandest in Georgia, sitting along the marshland like a white crown on green silk. But by the time Eveline returned, its columns were streaked with mildew and its windows clouded over like blind eyes. Her father had been dead 5 years, her mother too. The servants had left, taking what they could. Only the overseer, a thin man named Dillard, had stayed on, more out of habit than loyalty. He saw Eveline first, walking up the drive with her bare feet dragging dust, her white dress torn at the hem, a small wooden box pressed to her chest as if it contained her breath. Dillard swore she smiled when she saw him, though he couldn't tell if it was joy or something else, something quieter, like the smile of someone remembering a secret promise. When he asked her where she had been these past months, she said, simply, married. Then she laughed softly, a laugh that didn't belong to the living. No one in Savannah recalled a wedding. No one remembered any fiancé either. Yet that night Eveline lit candles in every room of the great empty house. Their trembling glow shone through the cracked shutters, and from the road travelers swore they saw shadows dancing along the upper hall, as if she were not alone. For weeks she kept to herself. She went down to the river each morning at dawn, barefoot, the hem of her dress soaked in dew, and she whispered to the water. Some said she was praying, others said she was talking to someone she believed stood beside her. And at night she played the old piano her mother had loved, but what drifted from it wasn't any song the neighbors knew. It was a low, twisting melody, something foreign, something that made the dogs whine. Then came the first of the screams. A fisherman named Elroy was pulling his nets near the Harrow Marsh one moonless night when he heard a woman crying. He said it wasn't a human cry. It was like the sound of a kettle shrieking, rising and falling with the wind. He rowed closer and saw her standing there on the river bank, her hair trailing behind her like dark smoke, her hands raised towards something invisible in the air. She was speaking, chanting, calling out a name that chilled him to the bone. He didn't understand it, but he remembered it, Azazel. When she turned and looked at him, her eyes reflected the moonlight, though there was no moon. By morning, the preacher from St. Augustine Church came to visit her, sent by the town council. The Reverend Solomon Pierce was a stern man, tall and narrow as a lamppost, who believed every sickness of the soul could be beaten out with prayer and scripture. He found Eveline in her mother's old parlor, pouring wine into 2 glasses, though only one place was set. "Miss Harrow," he said, "I hear you have returned to us, and that you claim to be wed." Eveline smiled. "Claim? No, Reverend, I am wed. My husband visits me nightly." "To whom?" She looked out the window then, her lips parting slightly. "To the one who gave me what heaven would not." The Reverend frowned. "You speak in riddles, child." "Then I'll speak plainly," she said to the master below. There was no laughter in her tone, only devotion. The Reverend left the house trembling. He went straight to the mayor and declared that the woman was possessed, that the devil himself had made a home in the Harrow plantation. Within a day the whole town knew. The curious and the foolish both came to see her. Some said she showed them a ring carved from black stone, colder than ice, that steamed when she held it to the sun. Others said she could summon shadows that moved when she spoke a certain word. But what frightened people most wasn't the things she said or did. It was the peace in her eyes, the kind of peace only the truly damned could have. One evening a storm rolled over the marsh, heavy and swollen, the kind that turned the air green before it burst. Eveline lit her candles again, one for every sin she could remember, and stood before the mirror in her wedding dress. The lace was yellowed now, but she still held it like something sacred. "My love," she whispered to the reflection, "you promised you would come when the thunder did." And then, behind her in the glass, a shape appeared, tall, dark, more suggestion than man. The candles flared and bent toward it. Her smile deepened, almost breaking her face. The next morning Dillard found the parlor scorched, the mirror was blackened as if by smoke, and Eveline was lying on the rug, breathing slow, her eyes open but unfocused. When he tried to move her, she whispered, "He took me below the water and showed me the fire beneath. It's beautiful there. He says I will reign beside him." For the rest of that week the rain did not stop. The river swelled over its banks, cattle were found drowned in the fields, and in town the preacher led nightly prayers, claiming the devil himself had claimed Savannah. Meanwhile Eveline recovered, or seemed to. She walked through town again, dressed in mourning black, though no one knew whom she mourned. Men stared after her, drawn by something they couldn't explain. One of them, a young shopkeeper named Charles Red, followed her one afternoon through the cemetery on Oglethorpe Hill. He said she was humming again, that strange, twisting melody, and when she reached the grave of her parents, she stopped and began to speak as if someone were there beside her. Charles heard her say, "You've kept your word, my love, but they still doubt, they still mock." And then, after a long pause, she turned and said into the empty air, "Shall I show them?" That night Charles told his friends he'd seen her rise from her knees and hold out her hands, and that the air around her had shimmered like heat rising from a forge, though the evening was cool. Within a fortnight 3 townsfolk vanished, the blacksmith's wife, the apothecary's boy, and a girl who tended to Reverend Pierce's house. None were found, but the townspeople said at night, from the Harrow estate, they could hear soft singing, 3 voices blending with Eveline's own. When the Reverend confronted her again, she met him at the door, serene and glowing by candlelight. "You take what isn't yours," he said. She smiled sadly. "They came willingly. He calls the willing first. Blasphemy, truth." Then she leaned close and whispered, "He said your faith is delicious." The Reverend fled, but that night he was seen wandering the cemetery, tearing pages from his Bible and throwing them into the mud. By dawn he was gone. After that no one went near the Harrow plantation again, except Dillard. He stayed because he couldn't leave, not because he was loyal, but because something in that house had taken hold of him too. He told the sheriff later that he'd wake some nights to find Eveline standing outside his door, humming softly, her shadow stretching too long behind her, touching the ceiling. She'd whisper, "He wants more. He is hungry." And Dillard, trembling, would ask, "Hungry for what?" "For love," she'd say, "and for the faith that refuses him." In the final days of that cursed summer, lightning struck the Harrow house. It burned for hours, visible across the marsh like a torch. When the flames died, there was nothing but black timber and ash. But no body was found. Weeks later, a traveler passing through Savannah claimed to see a woman in a tattered wedding gown walking the edge of the river at dawn. He said she was singing. He said the water boiled where she stepped. The townsfolk wanted to believe it was a ghost story, something to frighten children with. But late at night, when thunder rolled across the marsh and the wind carried that strange, low melody through the shutters, they remembered her words, the way she'd looked at the Reverend, unblinking, certain, serene, and they wondered if the devil had truly taken a bride. And somewhere beyond the veil of night, perhaps he smiled and whispered back her name. They buried Reverend Pierce on a cloudy morning that smelled of salt and ash. The marsh was swollen again, the air wet and swollen with gnats. No one spoke his name aloud. The preacher's body had been found 3 days after the Harrow plantation burned, a mile upriver, tangled among the reeds, his hands clutching his own Bible. its pages blackened and curling like leaves after frost. The townsfolk said his eyes were open, and that even in death they still looked afraid. Savannah had changed since the fire. People hurried through the streets after sunset, bolting their doors and shuttering their windows before the sky went fully dark. No one played the piano anymore, no one sang. The church bells, once proud and clear, now sounded muted, as if struck underwater. Those who had lived near the Harrow lands moved away, claiming they heard a woman's voice floating through the fog at night, whispering from the river's edge, "Come home, my love, it's lonely below." Sheriff Gideon Sloane was the first to say aloud what others only whispered, that the fire had not killed Eveline Harrow. He was a practical man, hard of jaw and harder of heart, who didn't believe in hauntings. But the morning after the flames died, when he and his men searched the ruins, they found footprints leading away from the ashes, bare, small, pressed deep into the damp earth, as if the ground itself had softened for her passage. They led to the marsh and stopped at the water's edge. Either she walked into the river, Sloane said, squinting against the glare, or something walked out with her. By the following week, livestock began to vanish. Pigs gutted clean as if butchered by invisible hands. Horses found tangled in their stalls, their eyes missing. The town doctor claimed it was disease. The blacksmith said it was coyotes. But Mrs. Red, the shopkeeper's widow, said she saw Eveline herself standing at the corner of Bull Street one night, just past midnight, wearing her scorched wedding gown and humming. "She smiled at me," Mrs. Red told the sheriff later, trembling as she spoke. Her teeth were red, Sheriff, red like cherries. Sloane didn't believe her, not fully, but he sent 2 deputies to search the river banks anyway. They returned pale, shaking, and refused to say what they'd seen. Only one whispered something about eyes under the water before taking sick for a week. That was when the Reverend's replacement arrived, a man named Josiah Crane, young and bright-eyed, newly come from Charleston, with a voice smooth as honey and faith strong enough to blind him. He said he'd heard of Savannah's troubles, that he'd been called to cleanse them. Evil doesn't take root unless the soil is willing, he told the congregation his first Sunday. And the soil here has been fed with lies. There was no devil bride, only a lonely woman lost in her grief, twisted by it. I will bring her peace. Some said his confidence was brave, others said it was foolish. That night, Reverend Crane went to the ruins of the Harrow plantation alone. The ashes still stank faintly of smoke. The columns stood like tombstones, their tops jagged against the starless sky. In the center of what had once been the parlor, he found the burned remains of a mirror, its surface cracked but not destroyed. When he bent close, he swore he saw movement in its glass, a shimmer like breath. Then faintly he heard a woman's voice behind him. "You speak of peace as if it were yours to give." He turned, nothing but the shifting dark. "Eveline Harrow," he called, "if you can hear me, I come not as an enemy. I come to help you find rest." Silence. Then, somewhere deeper in the ruins, a piano key struck once, just one note, low and trembling. The Reverend froze. When he lifted his lantern, he saw her standing among the shadows, her dress blackened to soot, her hair loose and wild, her face pale as bone. "You're too late," she said softly. "He already gave me rest." "Who?" She smiled. "My husband." And before he could move, the lantern light flickered, and she was gone. The next morning, the Reverend was found lying in the mud outside the church, soaked to the skin, his mouth filled with river water. He was alive but fevered, muttering nonsense. For 3 days he raved, calling out to someone named Azazel. When he woke, he refused to speak of it. But he left Savannah that very night, his hair turned half white. By now, the whole town believed the devil's bride had returned. Children claimed they saw her face in mirrors. A man swore his dead wife spoke through her voice when he passed the old Harrow gate. The baker's daughter was found walking through the streets before dawn, her eyes open but empty, humming Eveline's melody. When they tried to wake her, she whispered, "He's coming for the faithful." Then she collapsed. Sheriff Sloane tried to restore order. He forbade talk of devils, banned seances, locked up anyone caught wandering near the river after dark, but even he began to falter. He woke one night to find his own front door open, though it had been bolted. On the porch lay a single white rose, fresh, glistening with dew, and beneath it, written in ash, "For you, my love." His wife swore she saw a woman watching their house from the trees. By mid-autumn, the marsh itself had begun to change. Fishermen said the water ran black, thick as oil. The air smelled of iron and salt, and sometimes, when the wind was still, the river hummed, a low, endless note like a voice too deep to be human. Dillard, the old overseer, was still alive. He'd taken to living in a shack near the ruins, though no one knew why. When the sheriff finally confronted him, he found Dillard sitting before the burned foundation, carving small wooden figures, dozens of them, all women in wedding gowns. "She's close now," Dillard said, not looking up. "She told me she's building something down there, a kingdom, a place for the forgotten ones, down where—" Dillard raised a trembling hand toward the marsh. "Below." That night the sheriff ordered the river dammed, hoping to choke whatever curse lay within it. But before the work could begin, a storm unlike any in memory struck Savannah. Rain hammered for 3 days without pause. Lightning split the oaks, the church steeple was torn in two, and from the river people swore they saw lights, pale, flickering, like candles burning under water. When the storm broke, the dam was gone. The workers who'd stayed to guard it were never found. Only their tools remained, twisted and rusted, half buried in the mud. Then came the whispers. In every home, mothers said they heard someone calling from the dark corners of their rooms. A woman's voice, gentle, pleading, "He is hungry. Bring him what he's owed." In the tavern, the barkeep claimed the mirror behind his counter, clouded over with smoke, and when he wiped it clean, Eveline's reflection smiled back, though no one stood before it. And in the church, the last faithful few gathered to pray. But when they bowed their heads, they smelled sulphur. One by one, the candles snuffed out. Sheriff Sloane, desperate, gathered what men still had courage and rode out to the ruins. They reached them at dusk, the sky bleeding red behind the trees. The air was heavy, almost wet with heat. In the center of the ashes, where the old parlor had been, the earth had sunk inward, a wide black pit, smooth around the edges, as if carved by hands too precise to be human. Sloane knelt, lantern in hand, and peered into the hollow. There was no bottom, only darkness that seemed to breathe. "Get the rope," he ordered, but before anyone could move, a voice rose from the pit, a whisper that sounded like every voice they'd ever loved and feared. "Welcome home." The ground shuddered, the horses reared, and then she came. Eveline rose from the hollow like smoke, her dress floating around her, though there was no wind. Her eyes glowed faintly red, her mouth curved in something between sorrow and joy. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice layered, as if another spoke beneath it. "He doesn't like intruders." Sloane raised his pistol. "Eveline Harrow, by order of the state of Georgia." She laughed, a sound like glass cracking. "You think your laws reach him?" Behind her, the darkness in the pit rippled. Two enormous hands, shadows with shade, reached upward, gripping the edge of the earth. The men screamed, scattering. Only Sloane stood his ground, frozen, until a whisper brushed his ear. "He's been waiting for you too, Gideon." When the sheriff's men returned to town, their faces were gray, their eyes hollow. None spoke again. And at dawn, the Harrow ruins were gone. The pit had filled itself, smooth as if nothing had ever been there. But in the marsh, where the water lapped at the reeds, a woman's reflection could sometimes be seen, smiling, serene, wearing a black crown made of riverweed. They say Savannah still sleeps uneasy. The bells no longer ring, and no child born since that storm will set foot in the river. But when thunder rolls over the horizon and lightning dances across the marsh, the air grows thick with the scent of roses, and the people remember the woman who said she was the devil's bride. And deep below the earth, where the river never stops flowing, two voices sing in unison, a man's and a woman's, promising that one day Savannah will burn again. By the spring of 1831, Savannah had learned to live with silence. The town still stood, but its soul seemed to have thinned. People spoke in whispers, curtains stayed drawn even at noon, and every evening, just as the sun sank red behind the marsh, a strange fog crept in from the river, dense, glittering faintly, carrying the scent of iron and roses. The locals called it the bride's breath. They said if you walked too deep into it, you'd hear her humming and never find your way back. The Harrow plantation was gone, swallowed by vines and moss, yet something beneath it still breathed. The land sank a little more each month, as though the earth itself were caving in on some unseen hunger. Animals avoided the place, even the insects went quiet near its borders, but there were those who could not resist it. Men and women drawn by dreams, visions, or promises they never spoke aloud. At first they disappeared one by one, then by the dozen. The mayor sent letters north, begging for aid, but no messenger who rode out returned. When the letter finally reached Charleston, it was damp, the ink run to red. The seal bore a faint impression of a hand, not pressed in wax, but burned. That summer a stranger came to Savannah. He arrived on foot, his coat dusted with road ash, a satchel slung over one shoulder. He called himself Dr. Alaric Vance, a scholar of the occult from Boston, though his eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that spoke of deeper pursuit. He'd heard rumors of a woman who'd married the devil and of a town that no longer slept. He'd come to see if the stories were true, or if Savannah had simply gone mad. The few who met him said he was polite but distant. He took a room above the tavern, drank little, and spent his nights walking the riverbanks, taking notes by lamplight. He asked after the Harrow name, but most refused to speak it. Only one man, the half, mad overseer Dillard, would tell him what he wanted to know. She was taken. Dillard rasped, not against her will. He called her, same as he calls the rest. You'll hear it too soon enough. And this thing? Said Vance, this master below, what does he want from you? Dillard's lips trembled into something like a smile. Company? That night, Dr. Vance dreamt of a woman in a tattered wedding gown standing on the river, her eyes burning through the fog. She held out her hand to him and said, "You've come so far. Shall I show you what devotion costs?" When he woke, his sheets were wet with river water. The next day, he began his study in earnest. He collected stories, artifacts, anything left of the Harrow estate. In the old church archives, he found records of Eveline's birth 1830, the year her father's debts nearly ruined them. He found mention of a marriage license never filed, a disappearance of 3 servants the same month she left Savannah the first time, and a series of letters signed only E. H., each written in an unfamiliar script. The ink was darker than any he'd seen, black that shimmered red when held to the light. The last letter read, "He has promised me eternity, and eternity is such a small thing to ask when one has already lost everything else." As the days passed, Dr. Vance felt the town closing in around him. Doors shut as he approached, windows slammed, children crossed themselves in silence. It was as though Savannah itself had turned its face from him, afraid that his questions might wake what slept beneath its streets. But curiosity is a kind of sickness, and Vance was already infected. On the 7th night he returned to the ruins. The moon hung low, swollen, red as a wound. The air hummed faintly. The earth still bore that unnatural smoothness where the pit had once been. But when he pressed his palm to the ground, he felt warm, as if a pulse beat beneath it. He unpacked his tools, compass, crucifix, notebook. He began to read from a passage he'd copied from an old grimoire. Something meant to summon the lost. The air shifted. The candle flame bent sideways, though no wind stirred. Then he heard her. "Why do you disturb our rest, doctor?" He turned slowly. Eveline stood there, unchanged, her gown now pure white again, glowing faintly against the dark. Her face was calm, her voice soft, but the air around her shimmered with heat. "I came for truth," he said. "To know if you were real. Truth," she repeated. "You mortals still think it's something that can be held." She tilted her head. "Would you like to see mine?" Before he could answer, the earth beneath them cracked open, and light poured from below, crimson, pulsing like a heartbeat. The scent of sulphur burned his throat, and from that light a shadow rose, immense, unfathomable, shaped like a man but crowned in flame. Eveline bowed her head. "My husband," she whispered. "Doctor." Vance fell to his knees, unable to breathe. The thing looked at him, or through him, and he felt his mind bending, folding in on itself. Every memory he'd ever cherished began to burn away, replaced by one endless thought. "Serve? Why come here, seeker?" The voice thundered, though the lips did not move. "Do you crave faith or fear?" Vance tried to speak, but only a whimper escaped. Eveline's gaze softened. "He only came for proof, my love. Let him have it." The darkness swallowed him whole. When Vance awoke, he was lying in the center of town. His clothes were scorched, his hands raw, his eyes bloodshot. Around him, Savannah burned, houses cracked like tinder, the river glowed red, and through the smoke he saw her again, Eveline, walking down the main street in her wedding gown, untouched by flame. Wherever her feet passed, the ground turned to glass. The townsfolk fell before her, not in worship, but in surrender. Some reached for her, pleading. Others fled screaming. She only smiled. "He has risen," she said. "And this is our wedding feast." The church bell began to toll by itself, though the rope hung severed. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat, and with every note another building fell. "Doctor," Vance tried to run, but the fog thickened, blinding him. Voices whispered from all directions, familiar ones, pleading for him to join them. When he stumbled to the river, the water was gone, replaced by a chasm of light stretching downward into infinity. Eveline appeared beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Don't look down, doctor, look through." He did, and saw beneath the world a vast city of flame, its towers made of bone and iron, its streets crawling with shapes that wept as they worshipped. At its center stood a throne, and upon it a figure whose face was both beautiful and unbearable. "Do you see now?" she whispered. "This is where love leads when heaven forgets us." He turned to her. "Then why return here? Why bring hell to Savannah?" Tears gleamed on her cheeks, though they steamed as they fell. "Because he asked me for a dowry," she said. "Every bride must bring something of her own." And as she spoke, the light began to rise, swallowing the town. The screams faded into a great, distant silence. When the dawn finally came, there was no Savannah, only a plain of glass and ash where the city had been. The river had returned calm, its surface smooth as a mirror. Birds flew overhead, their reflections rippling in water that hid what burned beneath. Months later, travelers passing along the coast claimed they saw lights far below the surface, rows of them, like a city sunken but still alive. Some said they heard faint music rising from the depths, a woman's voice singing of devotion eternal. Dr. Vance was never seen again, but his notebook was found washed ashore near Tybee Island, its pages blackened but legible. The final entry read, "There is no hell below us. It's here, where love outlives mercy." And sometimes, on windless nights, when the marsh is still and the moon hangs like a dying ember, the people say the fog returns, the bride's breath rolling across the fields, humming that same tune. Doors shake, candles flicker, mirrors cloud with smoke, and if you listen long enough you can hear her whisper, "Till death do us part," and death has no hold on me.